All right, so as Democrats are still on track to get absolutely curb stomped in the 2022 midterm elections, Senator Bernard Sanders recently came out and gave some advice to Joe Biden and corporate Democrats more generally in terms of how he feels they could potentially avoid this incoming onslaught. So I got a good article breakdown here from Jake Johnson on Common Dreams saying, "Make Manchin cinema obstruction the central target in the midterms," Sanders tells Democrats. So there's some things in this that I agree with, some things that I kind of disagree with on him, but let's go ahead and get into some of the details here. They say, as Democrats scrambled to craft their midterm strategy amid rising fears of a GOP takeover, Senator Bernie Sanders on Thursday implored the party's leadership to offer voters an honest assessment of the roles of Senator Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema played in tanking the popular Build Back Better agenda and make clear that a larger Democratic majority is necessary to push it over the line. And he said, quote, "Say to the American people, look, we don't have the votes to do it right now. We have two corporate Democrats who are not going to be with us," Sanders said in an interview with Politico, warning that an increasingly authoritarian Republican Party stands an excellent chance of gaining control of the House and quite possibly the Senate if Democrats don't change direction. And he said, quote, "The leadership has got to go out and say we don't have the votes to pass anything significant right now. Sorry, you got 48 votes and we need more to pass it," added the Vermont senator. That should be the message of this campaign. So I kind of agree with him in terms of making the Sinema and Manchin brand of politics the center of mostly primary campaigns. Honestly, we saw this with John Fetterman against that corporate ghoul Connor Lamb. Connor Lamb was pretty much a self-ascribed Joe Manchin-style Democrat, and he obviously got absolutely obliterated even in a state like Pennsylvania, which typically is a more like purple state in many instances. So you see how toxic the branding of Sinema and Manchin can be, but that's mostly, I think, at least relegated to Democratic primaries and not so much in terms of a general midterm election strategy. And on the points that he was making in terms of Democrats going out and saying, listen, we don't have the votes, we only have 48 votes, we don't have 50, I honestly think that that's just pathetic and wouldn't go nearly enough in motivating especially young people, where young people have been the disproportionate fall off in Joe Biden's approval rating. It wouldn't go nearly far enough in motivating young people or people at all to go out and show up for Democrats once again. You can't just make this giant push in 2020 to say this is the most important elections of our lifetime. You have to go out, you got to vote for the lesser of two evils, vote blue no matter who, and then have voters and organizers and people across the country deliver the House, the Senate, and the presidency for you, and then just turn around a year or two into it and say, whoops, psych, I guess we didn't actually have control of the Senate because we have these two corporate ghouls within our own party who don't want to work on anything. So no, in and of itself, saying we only have 48 votes is, number one, a lie, and number two, wouldn't be nearly enough of a motivator to get especially young people to actually show up to the polls. And it's not just about Biden's complete inability or refusal to confront Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin throughout the entire negotiations on Build Back Better. That was definitely a big component of it. And, young people looking at that situation with all of the different promises that were made and material improvements to their lives and their futures, and seeing all of that get eviscerated and torn apart within the Democratic coalition, that definitely is going to have a suppressing effect on motivating young people to show up to the polls in the midterms. But it's not just that. I think on top of it, seeing Joe Biden go out there and repeatedly refuse to use the unilateral authority that he has as the president of the United States with his executive orders on things like marijuana legalization, on things like student debt cancellation, on things like even lowering prescription drug prices, all things that he has the ability to address through executive order, and we're just seeing him outright refuse to do it. I mean, even on just student debt cancellation, we just saw his plan for that. It's only $10,000 in student debt cancellation. It's going to be means tested, so it's not even a universal cancellation. Oh, and by the way, on top of that, it's going to be coinciding with a resumption in payments. So in other words, you might get $10,000 taken off your debt, but you're immediately going to have to start paying the same goddamn interest rates that'll probably overcome that $10,000 in months or a couple of years. And we also know that a plurality, if not an outright majority, of those who have a lot of this federal student debt are not going to be able to pay it off regardless. So it's just a completely incoherent strategy in terms of motivating young people to actually support your party. They're doing less than the bare minimum. If anything, they're actively through both their inaction and their actions worsening the lives of the American people in many different ways. But apparently that's one of his pieces of advice for Joe Biden and Democrats right now. But they continue saying Democrats are clinging to slim majorities in both chambers and the death of the party's flagship climate and social spending package package at the hands of Manchin and Sinema has intensified concerns that Republicans are set to win big in November despite the unpopularity of the GOP's agenda as laid out by the National Republican Senatorial Committee Chair, Senator Rick Scott. And I covered his plan on this channel if you want to go back and watch my video going through it. It was literally the most laughable shit you could possibly imagine. I mean, this dude was proposing probably the most unpopular pieces of policy that, anybody is floating right now. And this is, again, the head of the National Republican Senatorial Committee. So, if you can't weaponize their agenda of raising taxes on the poor, of slashing government programs like Medicare and Social Security, and doing all of these other ridiculous like patriotic education, nationalism, etc., restoring faith in our schools, all of these different delusional ideas that have been put forward by guys like Rick Scott, if you're not able to turn around and effectively weaponize that in a midterm, then I don't know what to tell you. I mean, every single thing that the modern Republican Party stands for is overwhelmingly unpopular. And so they get away with it because they're able to go out and talk about bullshit culture war non-issues like trans women in sports and gay teachers grooming your kids and, critical race theory corrupting the youth and all of these other completely fabricated issues that they use to basically distract from their own actual policy agenda on things like foreign policy, militarism, and especially economics. So the strategy for actually confronting Republicans in an election situation like this would have been, number one, don't let two members of your own party completely eviscerate your agenda while you watch from the sidelines and continue over and over and over again to pretend like they're acting in good faith, as Joe Biden has been doing. That would have been, number one, actually accomplish the things that you promised voters. But if you're in the situation that they're in right now, in today's moment, then you would still have to aggressively be pushing for economic policies that average working class Americans could get motivated and rallied around, instead of focusing on the things that Biden is actually focusing on, which they're going to point out down in this article too, which are basically just like Bush style politics. So let's go ahead and continue with some of the details here. They say congressional Democrats and President Joe Biden have seized upon Scott's right-wing blueprint as a part of their midterm messaging, but Sanders, who's been sounding the alarm over a possible midterm wipeout since January, argued Wednesday that you can't really win an election with a bumper sticker that says, well, we can't do much, but the other side is worse. And this has been the Democratic message for literally my entire life. I'm 22 years old. This is what I've been hearing since I was, younger, and, was a kid watching Obama go out and explain why, even with a supermajority, he only has the power somehow to pass a Mitt Romney-style right-wing piece of healthcare legislation like Obamacare. But, over and over and over again, this is all we hear. Lesser of two evils. Democrats are ineffectual and they're pathetic, but Republicans are evil. I mean, that might be true, but in terms of whether or not that's going to be effective in actually winning elections is a completely different question, to which the answer is absolutely not. It is not going to be enough. And yet this is still seemingly what Democrats are banking on, as all of the polling data that we have at our disposal is showing us that it's definitely not going to work. But finally, they finish off here saying, directly addressing President Biden, whose approval rating has dipped below 40% as he loses support among young voters and people of color. Sanders argued that the president should do as much as he can through executive action and tell the Democratic base, I want to raise the minimum wage, I want to deal with Medicare, I want to deal with housing, I want to deal with climate, I can't do it, I need more votes. And listen, I think that this is disingenuous because I don't believe that Biden actually believes in any of these things. I don't believe that he gives a shit about raising the minimum wage substantially. I don't believe that he cares about actually dealing with investing in public housing or dealing with climate in a legitimate way. And the reason I say that is because we've seen him be completely on the sidelines throughout all of the different fights on these specific issues. I mean, Democrats let the increase of the $15 minimum wage get tanked by a goddamn Senate parliamentarian who everybody understands has zero legitimate power whatsoever. So how are people supposed to believe that you are truly willing to go out and fight for these things and implement them and enact them in a legislative manner? How are we supposed to believe that you're actually going to do that if we've seen time and time again that you have absolutely no interest in confronting the rot and the corruption within your own party members that is preventing this type of shit from getting done? And listen, even in a dream scenario for Democrats in the midterms, they might pick up a couple Senate seats. That's a dream scenario for them. Honestly, that's being way too optimistic. But assuming that they don't lose the House, assuming that they maintain the Senate, maybe they get, one or two plus Senate seats if there's somewhat of a miracle. But even in that situation, you're still going to be left with the same exact goddamn situation in regards to the filibuster. And we've seen, Joe Biden coming out and saying he's not even in favor of getting rid of the filibuster to do things like protecting abortion rights price, for example. So there's no indication whatsoever to voters that even if they suck it up, even if they go out and organize, even if they go out and show up and vote for Democrats once again and bail them out in the midterm elections, there's no indication that the dynamic is going to change within the corrupting actors in the Democratic Party right now. There's no indication. So how are people supposed to get motivated? And again, it's not just that he's failed on the legislative front, it's also that he's failed on the messaging front, and especially on the executive orders that he could be using to address a lot of these issues. But really, just to put it in perspective here, finishing it off with what Biden is openly saying are his top midterm messaging priorities. They say, thus far, as Politico reported in April, Biden's election year strategy has largely been to emphasize police and defense spending, accentuate federal deficit reduction, and propose higher taxes on the ultra-rich. So two of these things, or I guess you could say three of these things, have been effectively accomplished. We do have record police budgets. We do have a record military budget. And Biden has been trying to reduce the deficit. But the one thing that we don't have is the one thing that would be by far the most popular of these different policy suggestions, and that would be hiking taxes on the ultra-rich. I mean, that's something that 80% of the American people agree that we need to do, and yet, again, that, along with the rest of Build Back Better, was completely eviscerated by members of Joe Biden's own party, with basically no word whatsoever from him, seemingly content with the reality that Joe Manchin is effectively the president, okay? So, that's the situation we have. I mean, he's literally using, like, Bush-style politics. How is any of this distinguishable from George W. Bush or Donald Trump? Deficit reduction, emphasizing police and military spending. What the fuck are you doing? I mean, this is a Democrat. This is the supposed, radical socialist Joe Biden, according to conservatives. And this is what he's choosing to focus on in a midterm election year, as especially young people, but overall the American people, are dealing with all of these different issues that are directly correlating to their material conditions. And Biden is not addressing any of those things. I mean, do you think more police funding, more military funding, and deficit reduction is going to materially improve the lives of average working class Americans to the point that they are going to be willing to show up and bail Democrats out in the 2022 midterms? Absolutely not. Nobody gives a shit about any of these things. The top issues for the American people right now are things like inflation and drug prices and, the economic situation that they're facing. And yet we've seen basically nothing on that. But just to remind you guys of some of the things, if you want to use the excuse of Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema in the legislative body as to why Joe Biden can't get anything done, well, we could check in with some of the executive orders that he could do. We know that under the 1965 Higher Education Act, he has the unilateral authority to completely wipe the debt slate clean, and yet we have $10,000 in student loan forgiveness, and oh, by the way, it's means tested, and oh, by the way, on top of that, it's going to be linked with a resumption in payments, meaning that even some of the people who are getting this mild debt relief are just going to be overwhelmed in the next coming months and years as their interest payments accumulate to be much more than $10,000. So, it's just completely pathetic on the executive orders that he has said that he may be willing to deploy, but on the ones that he hasn't deployed at all or has outright come out and said he's not in favor of, those are things that would be even more popular than student debt cancellation. So just to give you a couple examples, here from the David Dayen's breakdown on the executive orders that Biden could be deploying in a moment like this from the American Prospect. He says, use the authority under the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980 or Section 1498 of the U.S. Code to use march-in rights to seize patent licenses for prescription drugs not offered under reasonable terms and distribute the license to other manufacturers that can produce them more affordably. Okay, so in other words, you go to these gigantic big pharmaceutical corporations that are bribing the members of your own party, like Kyrsten Sinema, who's taken nearly $1 million from Big Pharma. You get around that corrupting influence within your own party, and you use an executive order in order to lower prescription drug prices for the American people. That would be wildly popular. Even if it gets, struck down in the courts doing this, the American people would see that you are actively trying to actually address their material concerns right now. You could also, again, do student loan cancellation, or you could do things like descheduling marijuana, which Biden does have the unilateral authority as the president of the United States to do. He could take marijuana off of the controlled substances list. So, so many different things that he could do, especially to appeal to young people, but also just the American people more generally. And he's not doing any of that. Not only that, but he's coming out and outright telling the American people directly, saying there's nothing I can do to do things like addressing inflation and bring down gas or food prices in the near term. Now, keep in mind, it's not as if like inflation is some natural weather event, okay? We know for a fact that especially in the fossil fuel industry, but also in the food sectors, we know for a fact that an outright majority of the inflationary pressure that average consumers and average working class people are feeling right now is a direct result of corporate profiteering. It is these gigantic billion-dollar corporations that are making record profits right now, billions and billions of dollars going to their executives, their CEOs, their shareholders, etc., all at the expense of the American people. And Biden is saying, whoops, sorry, I guess we just live in a capitalist country and there's nothing I can do about that. It's just completely fucking pathetic. But on top of it being like pathetic in terms of what a president could theoretically do with his power, not just in pushing his own party, but also using his executive power as well, on top of that, it's just like, what is the messaging strategy here? I mean, Bernie Sanders had some good points, I think, in terms of how they could maybe try to make some pathetic appeal to, protect their slim majorities in Congress. But you got a president in Joe Biden who's just coming out here and saying, oh, whoops, I just can't do anything about the biggest issues facing average Americans. What are you doing? What is the coherent strategy here that is being put forward? But we got another example here from last night. Biden went on Jimmy Kimmel Live, and they say, Joe Biden on issuing gun control executive order, I don't want to emulate Trump's abuse of the Constitution. Okay, so literally, I mean, the most neoliberal or liberal brain rot approach that you could possibly have to a moment like this. And listen, this is why leftists and socialists and communists say that liberalism paves the pathway to fascism. We're seeing it play out right now. We have deranged Republicans all around the country. Marjorie Taylor Greene, like in my video the other day, talking about how she openly supports Christian nationalism. We got Republicans in state legislatures all around the country basically trying to criminalize gay and trans existence, passing bills on critical race theory and trying to control the information that kids are exposed to, and pushing a nationalist and patriotic education on the next generation. All of these different things, all of the fascist pieces of legislation that a guy like Ron DeSantis, a future Republican presidential nominee, has been putting forward. And liberals are turning around. Joe Biden is turning around and saying, well, I want to be above that. I don't want to use the same dirty tactics that the fascists are using. We have to protect our institutions, which Republicans are actively trying to dismantle and destroy into a million pieces. I mean, again, this is why we say they're paving the pathway for fascism. Their inaction, their pathetic nature, and unwillingness to actually confront the centers of capital in this country to materially deliver on improvements to average people's lives, that is what leads to our descent into fascism to continue. I mean, right now, it's not just the Democrats are going to get curb stomped in 2022, probably going to lose one or both chambers of Congress, but on top of that, in 2024, Biden is planning on running again with like a lower approval rating than Donald Trump ever had. So, how do you look yourselves in the mirror and pretend as if you are the great bulwarks against fascism? You are the vanguard fighting against this fascist takeover of our so-called democracy, while you're actively doing absolutely nothing in a material way to prove to people that you're not only not as bad as the other side, but that you're better than the other side, and that you can actually fulfill even maybe 1/10 of the promises that you have been making to people for years now. It's just a completely pathetic situation, but this is exactly how we continue our spiral into the abyss.